layers. Can anybody tell me what layers do? That is a perfect answer. We have interacting effects, or more precisely, interacting continuous effects. And actually, if you look for the layers in the rules, you will see them in a section called Interaction of Continuous Effects. And specifically, we're talking about continuous effects that affect the characteristics of objects, mostly permanents, but I suppose you can also have layers for objects that are not on the map. There's also, of course, continuous effects that don't affect objects, like continuous effects that change hand size, effects that change the game rules. The layers are not really part of that. So we're really talking about continuous effects that change the characteristics or control of objects. Now, there is certain approaches one could take to this problem. Let's say I have 10 enchantments on the battlefield. Each creates a particular kind of continuous effect. And let's say you don't know anything about the rules of magic. What are some possibilities of how one could arrange the order in which those effects are applied? Ben?
Most recent ones supersede the previous.
Right. Timestamp order. Can anybody try to explain to me why going just by timestamp order might be a bad idea? I don't know your name, but please.
You would have to keep track of the order that everything entered over the course of the entire game, which would be problematic because some people don't have the best memory for that.
Exactly. It's a huge memory problem. Input from here?
It also creates inconsistency in rulings because a player will say, well, the last time this is how it worked. Why doesn't it work the same way this time?
Good point, good point. Yes, back there?
Yeah. It also creates certain situations that aren't intuitive. Like, if you turn a creature white, Honor of the Pure should affect it. But if that happened later, it would not affect it.
Exactly. So those are actually some good points that we should put down on this whiteboard. We want consistency. We want intuitive results. And we don't want memory problems. We can figure out how humility works. And the way Wizards of the Coast did this was basically they decided we need categories of effects so that the kinds of effects that other effects tend to depend on are applied first just by virtue of what kind of effect it is. So you don't actually have to look at your whole table and all the 40 effects that are on it and figure out the dependency of what depends on which. You basically classify the effects in a certain number of categories and then say they're always applied in the order of these categorizations. And Wizards kept the basic idea of doing this in dependency order was basically encoded in this system by saying that the effects that tend to be independent are applied first, and the kinds of effects that tend to be more dependent go later in the chain. And that is the whole idea of how the layers are structured the way they are. You have more independent effects first and the more dependent effects later. So now let's brainstorm. What kinds of classifications for effects do we have? Anybody, give me a category of effect.
Control magic.
Control magic, sure. Copy effects.
My personal favorite is text.
Text, sure, we have that. Text effects. Let's go over here. Type. Type changes, sure. Somewhere we have to have type changes. Is that on there? Yes? Yes. Oh. Pardon? Color. Yes, color. You behind Ben.
Ability adding and
Abilities, yes. So power times modify, yes. Yes. Characteristic defining abilities. Running out of space here. I have two more here.
Setting power and toughness?
Setting
Like 1-1.
toughness.
Right.
And the last one, back there.
Switching power toughness.
Right, switching power toughness. Let me answer that.
Oh, the barrel.
All right, so these are all the different kinds of effects that can happen in a game of Magic from continuous effects. And now we have to figure out a good order in which to apply those. As I said, the design goal is to put the more dependent effects later and the more independent effects earlier. So let's think about, for example, text changing and type changing. In which order would we want to apply these kinds of effects?
Text first.
Pardon?
Text first. Text first.
Text first. Why?
Because sometimes the text is, sometimes the type can be affected by the text. So like Blood Moon, for example.
Exactly. We have type changing effects of the kind, well, as Blood Moon says, all non-basic lands are mountains. If we apply a text changing effect that changes mountains to swamps, we want Blood Moon to say all non-basic lands are swamps. So we have to apply the text changing effect to this Blood Moon before we apply the type changing effect that Blood Moon actually creates. So in order for this interaction to work out intuitively, we have to apply the text change before we apply the type change. So that's why in the layers, the text layer comes somewhere before the type layer. Control and copy. In which order should we apply those two kinds of effects? For example, let's say I copy mind control. Somebody has a mind control on a creature. I do a copy enchantment, copy the mind control. For the control effect to actually be there at the time it applies, it has to be copied over from the mind control first. So the copy effect will happen first, and then the control changing effect should be applied, and in that fashion we actually get the intuitive result that the control changing effect that I'm getting from this enchantment can actually be applied. So they're going to be in this order somewhere. Now the question is, do I put them before or after the pair of text and type? That's one good reason. Another one would be, for example, Blood Moon. If I copy Blood Moon, the copy effect has to happen first to actually get the type changing effect that Blood Moon creates. Otherwise, my copy enchantment of Blood Moon would do nothing. If I, apply the type changing effect first, and well, my copy enchantment doesn't have a type changing effect now, and then things get weird. So, as Regina already said, copy effects can change basically anything about what the card does. So that's why copy effects have to happen first, and then the control change happens sometime after that. So we know this is kind of the order that we want to go in. What about color and ability? There are effects that say that a creature of a certain color gains a certain kind of ability. In order for this to make sense, we have to apply color changes first, and then the ability change. So now the question is how we arrange those in here. Okay, so we definitely agree that we want color changes after text changes. Now, of course, we could try to squeeze this in here between the text and the type, but the actual order is indeed text comes after the type change. Trying to think if there's actually an example of why color should come after type. I don't know, maybe something of the kind of all goblins are red. I don't know. All right.
There is all goblins are black, isn't there?
Strongest Crusade.
Strongest
Oh,
Crusade.
okay. Yeah, then that actually makes, that actually is a motivation for having it in this order. All right, and now of course we have all the power and toughness things. I guess it makes sense to do all those in one big batch or in one big bunch, keep them together. And now the question is, should they come early or should they come late?
Wolf is a good example for the copy.
Well, we definitely want power and toughness changes after color changes because there's definitely things like white creatures gain +1/+1 or things like that. Power and toughness depends on lots of things, and nothing depends on power and toughness. There are no effects that say creatures with power greater than 5 or 3, So then we just have to think about in which order we want to apply these 5 guys. Setting power and toughness should come relatively early. That is, we can probably agree on that. Yes, back there.
CDA affects in all zones, so it's in the graveyard. So it actually would be the first because it's kind of more universal.
Right. Characteristic defining abilities basically give you information that would normally be elsewhere on the card, so you apply that first to get that out of the way. And then the setting effect replaces or overwrites what is written in the bottom right corner, so that also comes very early. And then I guess the question is, what do we do with these, the modifying and the counters?
It doesn't matter.
Right, the order of those two doesn't really matter because addition is commutative, as we say. I think it's this way. Very nice. Why?
Let's just get all along.
There was a card printed way back in the day that explained.
So that is the layer system that Wizards of the Coast came up with as a solution to the problem of how we arrange continuous effects and make the result make sense. It's nicely ordered. And now the question is, if you have 2 effects that happen in the same layer, you still need to know what to do with those effects. And that is where the old approach of doing dependency and timestamp comes in. However, now that we have categorized our effects into these little layers, rather than having 40 effects all at the same time that we have to look at, we have them categorized into smaller subsections per layer. So the amount of effects that you have to look at to see if they are dependent on each other, that number is much smaller now because we have chunked our effects into these easier to digest categories. And then within each layer, you basically arrange your effects in timestamp order, except for the effects that depend on other effects in the same layer. Those have to go first. And that is an important thing to realize, that dependency is only a question within each layer. Let's talk about that interaction. Let's say we have humility and opalescence on the board. And if you are not familiar with what opalescence does, it says that all other non-aura enchantments become creatures whose power and toughness is equal to their converted mana cost. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Can somebody double check me? Okay. So, and humility of course says that all creatures lose their abilities and become 1/1. So, let's write down our layers. We have copy, control, text, type, color, abilities, DP, CDA, set, modify, counters, and switch. So those are our layers and sublayers. And let's write down what effects or what kinds of effects we have. Do we have anything in copy?
No.
Do we have anything in control?
No.
Anything in text changing? Yes. What text change effect do we have?
Making them a creature.
That is not text change. A text changing effect literally has to include the word text in it. It says change the text of target spell or permanent by doing something. So if it doesn't say the word text in it, it is not a text changing effect. It is, in fact, a type-changing effect. From opalescence, we have the type-changing effect that says that non-aura enchantments are creatures. So we have, from O, we have enchantments are creatures. And I apologize for my handwriting. Do we have color-changing effects? No, no color-changing effect either on humility or on opalescence. What about ability changing?
Yes.
Yes. We have creatures lose abilities, or all creatures lose abilities. And that comes from humility. Do we have any characteristic defining abilities for power and toughness? No, I see people shaking their head. What about power and toughness setting?
Yes.
Yes. Which power and toughness setting effects do we have? Yes, we have two. We have opalescence setting to CMC, and we have humility setting to 1-1. So we need to know the timestamp order of those two effects. Let's say opalescence was there first. So we have opalescence setting it to CMC, and we have humility setting it to 1-1. And lo and behold, we don't have any dependency to worry about, because what opalescence does, setting it to CMC, doesn't depend on what humility does, and vice versa. They just do their thing of setting it to number without any care in the world. So that's why they're applied strictly in timestamp order, and everything else only has one effect per layer. So to get to the end result that we want, we just start with the printed characteristics that are on each card, and then go down in layer order and in timestamp order down here. So opalescence, of course, does not affect itself, right? So opalescence is still an opalescence that is just an enchantment. Humility becomes a creature, loses its abilities. Oh, wait a minute, what happens here? There is a rule that says, basically, if an ability creates effects in different sublayers, and if this effect has already started to apply, it will continue to apply in the later layers. So this 1-1 effect is in fact still there, or will be applied, even though the ability that is creating this effect has somewhat magically disappeared in layer 6. It still continues to apply. So because of the timestamp order that we have here, humility is now an enchantment creature without any abilities and a power and toughness of 1-1. And if the timestamp order is the other way around, then it would of course be a 4-4, I think, 4 is the converted mana cost of ability. So yeah, we get these kind of weird corner cases in situations like this. I mean, that's the reason why this rule exists, saying that if part of it already applied, then the remainder of the effect still applies, so we get a reasonable end result. Yes, Joe?
All right.
It's very important to separate the word ability from the word effect. We are talking about the interaction of continuous effects. Some of those effects can create abilities or take abilities away. So if you confuse those two words with each other, which some players and starting judges sometimes do, because it's not a very clear separation in their minds of what is an ability and what is an effect. But you have to be really clear on this separation if you're talking about complicated layer questions, because otherwise you're going to get really confused. So an object has abilities. Those abilities create effects. No? That's the mnemonic here, the prayer you need to chant. Let's talk about Magus of the Moon versus humility. So I'm going to leave humility there because we already know what it does and where. Magus of the Moon says non-basic lands are mountains. Which layer does that fall into? Right. So the Magus of the Moon, that says non-basic lands are mountains. So if I have my, I don't know, Bayou or something, and I want to know what that is, I go through the layers and apply all these effects here. And in layer 4, I encounter the effect from Magus of the Moon that says that non-basic lands are mountains. Well, my Bayou is a non-basic land, so it now becomes a mountain. Then I go to layer 6, where creatures lose all abilities. So this is where Magus of the Moon loses his ability that says that all non-basic lands are mountains. What happens to my Bayou?
Still a mountain,
Still a mountain. Why?
because there's nothing after, you don't go like backwards through layers, you always
Exactly.
go top down.
You go, yeah, Mindy.
And also, just because it loses the ability in layer 6, the effect is in the type layer, so the effect is still there.
Correct. Goes back to what I was just rambling about, that we have to separate the concept of an ability from the effect that is created by this ability. The Magus's ability creates an effect that says that my Bayou is now a mountain. In layer 6, we are removing the ability, so now this Magus does not have this ability anymore, but it's already created the effect of turning my Bayou into a mountain, and we don't go backwards to, change this layer structure, so we are getting the slightly unintuitive result that Magus of the Moon has no abilities, but it's still creating the effect on this Bayou, making it a mountain.
What if I play Gruel Turf, which is the Gruel bounce land?
Okay,
It says this enters the battlefield tapped, and when this enters the battlefield, return a land to your hand, or sacrifice Gruel Turf.
No, just return it.
Just return the land.
Because you happen to have a land.
Yeah.
If you don't have a land, you return to
right. Okay, well, it has a replacement effect that changes how it enters the battlefield. This replacement effect applies before it is on the battlefield, so we don't actually have to worry about what effects might happen on it. So it still enters the battlefield tapped. And then when it enters the battlefield, we look at it to see whether it has any abilities. And, well, we go through this, see that non-basic lands are mountains. Cruel Turf is a non-basic land, so it is now a mountain. And of course, part of changing a land to a basic subtype is that all abilities that are printed on it get removed. This, by the way, does not happen in layer 6, even though it sort of changes what the abilities on it are. It is a side effect of the type changing effect that happens in layer 4, which is also kind of a non-intuitive thing, but that's just the way it is. It's a side effect of making it a mountain, so suddenly it has no abilities anymore. So when you ask the game for triggered abilities, the game says, I don't see any. So you do not bounce it. Yes?
I think another common one that gets pulled up with this is, let's say there is that Gruel Turf on the field as well, and now you want to play a Vesuva, how does that get to play out? That's a question that comes up and gets asked.
Okay. Not really sure what that has to do with layers, but
Vesuva
Copies the land.
oh, you mean while the Magus is on the battlefield? you mean?
Yeah, while this is in effect.
Right. Well, you choose what to copy as Vesuva is entering the battlefield. At this point, it is not being affected by Magus's effect yet, so it still gets to copy something.
Yeah.
So you're creating the copy effect that applies to layer 1, saying that Vesuva is Bayou or whatever you chose. But then, of course, you still go through the layers and apply all those effects. So it is now a copy of a Bayou that is now set to a mountain. So it is a mountain while the Magus is in play. And then when you bounce the Magus, this effect goes away, and then the Vesuva becomes whatever it was copied.
So to expand on what he was saying, what if you have humility out because goblins? Your goblins will no longer get +1/+1, right? Correct?
Correct.
Because that applies after humilities.
Correct. Goblin Chieftain does what? Goblins?
Get
Other goblins.
Does it also give an ability to something?
It gives haste.
Haste. Okay. Which is actually an interesting example to talk about. So let's see, we still have humility. And Goblin Chieftain. Goblin Chieftain says goblins have haste.
And you also +1/+1.
Who's your separate ability?
Right, but the haste is in layer 6.
Yeah.
And then in power and toughness modifying, we have goblins get +1/+1.
But it's interested in trying to keep a level humility line. Which is
But of course, well, let's talk about this. Layer 6 is the first layer where we have anything interesting going on. We have Goblin Chieftain's effect that wants to give goblins haste. We have Humility's effect that wants to remove all abilities on creatures, including, of course, the ability that creates this effect here. This is an example of dependency. We actually haven't talked about this in great detail because it's not really important for many things, but dependency can come from several circumstances. An effect changes what another effect applies to. An effect changes what another effect does. Or an effect changes the other effect's existence. And this is one of those examples for the last case where applying Humility's effect changes the existence of Goblin Chieftain's effect by removing the ability that creates that effect. So Goblin Chieftain's ability, or rather this effect that is created by Goblin Chieftain's ability is dependent on Humility's effect. So Humility's effect must be applied first, which means that this effect suddenly is no longer there, so it doesn't apply. And this effect isn't there, so it doesn't apply. Going backwards in layers, of course, wouldn't be a problem since those effects have already applied. If we're within the same layer, crossing out this effect really does the thing of this effect not happening anymore. So Goblin Chieftain plus Humility basically means we have a humble Goblin Chieftain that is 1/1 and does not give Goblins haste because that ability, or the ability that creates that effect, has been removed by Humility's effect.
So that's irrespective of timestamp order?
Correct. Regardless of timestamp order, you get this result because Goblin Chieftain's effect is dependent on Humility's effect. And I think we're just about out of time. Are there any other questions? Comments? Applause? Well taken.